Judas Iscariot is portrayed as the ultimate betrayer of Jesus. His gospel has been hidden away for most of history and intentionally unincluded from the Bible. His words were erased, and most evidence that could be used to defend himself. He went down in history known solely for betraying our Savior, Jesus Christ. In the Gospels, Judas's betrayal sets the stage for crucifixion, which is the central act of salvation in Christian theology. Casting him as the villain simplifies the narrative because someone must be responsible for Jesus' death. Judas was chosen by Jesus as one of the 12 apostles. Some would say that he was chosen for a reason. He was the treasurer for Jesus and the disciples. Therefore, he managed the donations given to the poor. Judas was in charge of the very thing that Christ preached against, which was loving money. John, another disciple of Jesus, named a dishonest pattern of Judas thieving from the money bag. He also called him the opposite of Mary, which painted him to be greedy and deceitful. It is important to note that John often made contrasts that were rooted in extreme all-or-nothing thinking. For him, there was light versus darkness, truth versus lies, and love versus betrayal. We will look at Judas without the influence of these dichotomies. By painting him as purely evil, the narrative avoids grappling with nuanced moral questions about why someone loyal to a cause might act against it. Judas's character was of someone who was cautious, strategic, and skeptical, especially of Jesus. While being financially savvy, his weakness shows in his social vulnerabilities. If he were truly stealing, according to John, and would regularly get caught, it signifies a blind spot for how he's being perceived by others. It could also indicate constant monitoring by the very people who continuously catch him. It could also indicate a desperate need despite the risk of moral judgment. But nonetheless, Judas was gifted in areas of finance management and not social suave. Due to this lack of outward social etiquette, he may have went out of his way to meet group expectations to compensate. This would leave him vulnerable to moral reframing by someone more charismatic and morally authoritative. Both Jesus and John showed these personality characteristics. John already shared his convictions about Judas periodically, setting the narrative for Judas, who habitually isn't shown defending or covering his mistakes. If Judas was sloppy with his deception, yet simultaneously had a desire to contribute and maintain harmony, he is an easy target for scapegoating. Such a person would be dutiful even if that meant going against social judgment, as he seems blind to it. Perhaps he can be led by Jesus' vision. When led by someone who can do no wrong, it would be difficult to get any justice due to them being idolized in the eyes of those who follow them. Jesus had subtle psychological influence over everyone. He knew how to approach each of his disciples uniquely to meet their hidden desires, as shown in John 2:24 through 25. He knew what was in each person. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus drops hints about betrayal and cryptically primes Judas for his destiny. We see this in John 13:21 through 27, where Jesus identifies the betrayer at the Last Supper, giving Judas direct attention and eye contact. Then there's John 6:70, Have I not chosen you, the 12, yet one of you is a devil? John 13:21, one of you will betray me. He subtly identified Judas, yet maintained plausible deniability despite it being obvious to everyone. He left the identifiable betrayer's identity vague enough for Judas to fester in paranoia and guilt. This would naturally happen as Jesus handpicked him, despite knowing that Judas represented everything Jesus was weak at. Jesus demonized money and Judas by association because he managed the finances of the group. What would Judas be guilty about other than the frustration with poverty and the constant targeting of his character? If one had no place to lay their head at night with Jesus, how long would it take for you to steal from a money bag, for food or some comforts? Jesus used strategic positioning by allowing Judas's flaws to be spotlighted while he retained moral high ground. You see a similar strategy with a covert narcissist, and they typically target the individuals who could potentially expose their deceit. There is room for potential envy as well, because Jesus was weak at grounded action. Sometimes people subconsciously attack those who represent something they struggle to achieve and demonize people who naturally have it. This is because that person simply existing within proximity to this narcissistic person will expose their lack of that quality or skill. Therefore, the narcissistic individual is reminded that they are not perfect, causing a narcissistic injury and then retaliating by targeting said individual. Judas Iscariot is an imperfect person, and I will not display him entirely as a victim. He may have been attracted to Jesus' power as he seemed to work within his own interests. He wanted to follow the Messiah who will fulfill this prophecy and stand up against Rome. Jesus had a habit of repeating certain patterns, like favoring Mary Magdalene as her name was that of his mother's. There is little mention of Jesus' brother Judas, though. Most of his siblings were lost in history as Jesus' destiny was deemed more important than any of theirs. Jesus displays many characteristics of a golden child, and if his brother Judas was a scapegoat by any means, Jesus would have simply been misplacing his anger onto Judas Iscariot. It seemed that his family was expendable as he denied them in previous scriptures. Is it possible that he covertly viewed everyone that way, as expendable? How far would you go in order to be included in this divine plan? Judas Iscariot was well aware of destiny. He listens carefully to Jesus' teachings. His reactions to every indirect jab at him indicated his sensitivity towards Jesus' moral judgment. Because Judas believed that Jesus was the Messiah, because of this, it's only understandable to see why Judas would care about Jesus' moral judgment in particular. But again, he's not socially suave. He's sloppy. Therefore, he's sensitive towards how Jesus views him. But with his personality characteristics, he cannot perform adequately up to Jesus' standards or read the room, so to say. Given that Judas Iscariot is dutiful and wants to please the Messiah, wants to fulfill Jesus' divine plan, he follows and obeys Jesus anyway. When examining the way Jesus treated his disciples, there is a stark contrast between his idealization of his perceived loyal and the devaluation of Judas. Toward the faithful disciples, Jesus used language of affection and honor, calling them friends, children, and the chosen, even promising them thrones in his kingdom. They were uplifted as insiders with eternal purpose and reward. Judas, however, was singled out early on with the subtle digs, such as being called a devil. And later he was outright branded as doomed. Matthew 26:24. It would be better if he had never been born. This form of splitting, which is idolizing someone while demonizing the other, it is a hallmark of narcissistic leadership. It establishes a system of favorites while assigning a scapegoat to absorb projected negativity, therefore tightening loyalty from the rest. This manipulation becomes even clearer in how Jesus balanced public praise with humiliation. Peter, James, and John were elevated into his inner circle, and even when Peter failed, Jesus reframed the failure as a teaching moment before reinstating him lovingly. By contrast, Judas was humiliated during the Last Supper. In front of the group, Jesus both exposed and marked him, handing him bread and declaring, "What you are about to do it quickly." John 13:27. The triangulation of praising someone while shaming the other isolated Judas, but strengthened the bond between the others and Jesus. Similarly, Jesus engaged in selective intimacy, tenderly leaning on the beloved disciple John and entrusting him with his mother's care, while Judas received intimacy only as a cruel setup in the form of the mocking kiss of betrayal. Such selective closeness is another narcissistic strategy used to pit followers against each other while keeping the leader in control. Judas was positioned to be burdened with the inevitable blame as the man who caused the crucifixion. The failures of the remaining disciples were softened and reframed as essential in the storytelling of Jesus and his 12 disciples. They showed traits of cowardice, doubt, and abandoned Jesus when it became too dangerous. Judas's failure, however, was absolute and irredeemable. He then was woven into prophecy so that he was stripped of any agency. This rewriting of events is an obvious narcissistic tactic. Loyalists remain redeemable no matter their flaws, while the scapegoat is permanently toxic and disposable. He created these hierarchies of estimated value and controlled the narrative to preserve his image. Judas became the perfect fall guy, ensuring the others stayed bound and bonded to Jesus through exclusivity. We see a recurring pattern where narcissists require someone to take the fall for them. Lucifer carried this role, as have countless scapegoats throughout history and into the present. What tradition paints as Judas's betrayal of Jesus now looks like an act of retaliation or revenge. If Judas had devoted himself for so long under the belief that his sacrifice would serve the Messiah, only to realize that Jesus was a fraud, then his final acts could be seen as cashing out on this disillusionment. In the time of Judas, Jewish society was charged with anticipation for the Messiah, who would liberate Israel from Roman domination. This expectation was not spiritual in the abstract sense. One would say that it's concrete and political. The Jews imagined a leader like King David, one who would restore the kingdom, defeat oppressors, and establish justice. Judas risked much to follow Jesus, and the promise of such a future seems like the fulfillment of a long-held prophecy and collective yearning. Yet, Jesus' approach to messiahship stood in stark contrast to this vision. Instead of rallying an army or plotting the overthrow of Rome, he taught radical passivity. Love your enemies, turn the other cheek, embrace humility, all of which can be interpreted as accepting suffering. To those waiting for a conqueror, it was dangerous. It encouraged surrender to Rome under the guise of holiness. Worse still, Jesus repeatedly announced his coming death in Mark 8:31. This made him appear already defeated, and the prediction looked like strategic self-destiny. He orchestrated his fate using Judas as a pawn and then reframed his inevitable demise as God's will. To a follower expecting liberation, this would naturally appear as fraudulence. Jesus' teachings show an underlying psychological dynamic of altruistic narcissism. Altruistic narcissists gain a sense of moral superiority through their suffering. By constantly presenting himself as the Son of Man, destined to suffer, Jesus avoided conquering anything at all. He successfully rebranded suffering into moral greatness and strategically set up his death to be his greatest accomplishment. You could also view it as his performance of the ultimate self-sacrifice. Jesus' pain is framed within Christian doctrine as humanity's salvation, while his death symbolizing the ultimate sacrifice of dying for your sins. Yet the lived experiences of believers complicates this claim. Many still feel punished for sin or fear the threat of eternal damnation, which raises the question, if forgiveness has been granted, why do we continue to live under the shadow of guilt, shame, and judgment? By positioning his suffering as singular, universal, and definitive, Jesus effectively hijacked the narrative of human suffering. His pain becomes the measuring stick against which all pain is judged, rendering the struggles of others secondary or illegitimate. Followers are subtly discouraged from voicing or validating their own suffering because the ultimate response is always, "He already died for your sins." In psychological terms, this mirrors altruistic narcissism, which is the projection of selflessness that in reality functions to center one's own suffering as supreme. This dynamic carries the logic of gaslighting. The implicit message is that human beings have no right to fully acknowledge or express their pain, because it has supposedly been nullified through the crucifixion. Believers are encouraged to reinterpret their suffering not as valid experiences of harm, but as spiritual tests or reminders of Christ's sacrifice. In this way, the doctrine erases lived experience under the guise of empathy, forcing people into dependency on an extreme narrative rather than their own truth. Unlike the other disciples, Judas refused to let his own suffering be erased by the narrative of Christ's sacrifice. While Jesus elevated his suffering into a universal doctrine, Judas's suffering was used against him, as he was branded as evil, then cast outside the circle of redemption. For Judas, the tension between expectation and reality would have been unbearable. He may have followed Jesus with the conviction that he would lead Israel to victory, but over time it became clear that Jesus was not interested in liberation from Rome. Instead, he appeared determined to stage his own martyrdom. Judas, having sacrificed years of his life, might have felt deceived. His eventual theft from the communal money bag could have been read as an attempt to salvage something from what he recognized as a collapsing and fraudulent movement. While later tradition paints Judas as racked with guilt and confusion, The psychological burden of such conditioning explains why Judas's guilt spiraled into despair rather than into deeper self-reflection and clarity. Had he been able to step outside of that framework, one might imagine him living long enough to understand and recognize his act as a form of resistance against manipulation. Part of what makes Judas's gesture intelligible is Jesus' own relationship to poverty and material life. Jesus deliberately chose homelessness as a form of symbolic rejection of wealth. He was not homeless as a product of trauma or systematic oppression. He demonized money while simultaneously dismissing the lived reality of poverty with remarks such as, "The poor you will always have with you." Matthew 26:11. This reveals that poverty became a backdrop against which Jesus could stage his altruism. Such an attitude suggests a narcissistic positioning, where the suffering of others is preserved rather than alleviated in order to highlight the giver's selflessness. To dismiss poverty as permanent while condemning wealth without engaging with the structural realities that create deprivation constitutes performative goodness. Judas then may be understood as the one disciple who broke from the collective delusion and saw through the contradictions. Jesus had been heralded as a liberator who would upend injustice and restore dignity to the oppressed. Yet, his actions signaled spiritualized resignation, a moral theater that ultimately reinforced passivity. By recognizing that Jesus was not the liberator he had been promised, Judas embodied a painful clarity that others refused to admit. Jesus' teachings on love are framed as the highest moral vision in history. Looking at it through a purely psychological lens displays that his divine love mirrors the cycle of covert narcissistic abuse. While many interpret his words as holy, their psychological structure fosters dependency. It erodes self-worth and manipulates followers into cycles of guilt and coercive control. He teaches his followers self-erasure, to idealize suffering, conditional affection, and punishment for dissent, all in the name of his Father in heaven Yahweh, whom he has a codependent relationship with. Jesus' love is exclusive. No one comes to the Father except through me. John 14:6 is a form of emotional blackmail. It isolates people from natural forms of love like family by declaring them invalid unless filtered through him. This is the abuser's tactic of control. Without me, you are nothing. Such exclusivity fosters dependency and black and white thinking, where love outside of him is deemed worthless. Equally damaging is Jesus to call self-neglect, deny yourself, take up your cross. Matthew 16:24. While theologically framed as freedom from ego, psychologically it strips identity and enforces enmeshment. A disciple's needs, desires, and boundaries no longer matter unless they serve him. Just as an abuser demands the erasure of a partner's individuality, this teaching promotes chronic guilt, martyrdom, and codependency. Normal human instincts for safety or rest are demonized as selfishness, leading to lives marked by oppression and shame. A third dimension is the idealization of suffering. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. John 15:13 reframes pain as proof of love. This mirrors narcissistic abuse, where the victim is told, "If you love me, you will endure pain for me." People stay in harmful dynamics, overgive, and burn out, believing their suffering is evidence of true devotion. These patterns coalesce in what psychologists might call altruistic narcissism. Jesus constantly positioned himself as the ultimate martyr while allegedly suffering and sacrificing for others. His ultimate sacrifice of all would be him dying. But this self-sacrifice is not truly selfless. It builds moral superiority and eternal indebtedness. His followers are left feeling that they can never measure up, so they are trapped in perpetual obligation to the one who supposedly gave everything. The relational dynamic reinforces this control through alternating love bombing and smear campaigns. Jesus' repeated commands to deny the self, love the enemy, forgive endlessly, and turn the other cheek may appear virtuous on the surface, but functionally, they condition people to accept mistreatment and endure cycles of abuse. In psychological terms, they reflect a framework of codependency where the follower's identity is dissolved in service to another's will. This became clearest in his treatment of Judas. From the beginning, Judas was chosen for the role of scapegoat. Jesus knew Judas would one day betray him, yet instead of removing him from the group or offering genuine redemption, he deliberately kept Judas close, ensuring that when the moment came, Judas's downfall would serve the larger narrative. This is a snake-like maneuver. If Judas were truly such an evil, untrustworthy person, why keep him at his side for years? Why entrust him with the group's finances? The only logical explanation is that Jesus intended all along to use Judas as a dramatic contrast, or the permanent cautionary tale, the disciple who existed only to be demonized. By setting him apart as permanently damned, Jesus betrayed Judas long before Judas ever betrayed him. Unlike Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times, or Judas, who doubted the resurrection, Judas was not offered a path to restoration or forgiveness. In this sense, Jesus betrayed Judas long before Judas ever betrayed him. This dynamic reveals traits of malignant narcissism in Jesus' behavior. By selecting Judas early on, keeping him close, and openly labeling him as the one who would betray, Jesus effectively created a role that Judas could never escape. It was a manufactured narrative in which Judas was groomed to fail. When Jesus declared Judas's fate in front of the other disciples, it functioned both as humiliation and psychological imprisonment. Judas was never truly free. His identity was scripted by Jesus, and his end was preordained by a leader who simultaneously demonized him for playing the role he was forced into. One may even question if Jesus pushed Judas into committing suicide, and that is the ultimate signifier of a malignant narcissist. From the arguments presented, I cannot help but feel otherwise. Such behavior aligns disturbingly with the abusive dynamics attributed to Yahweh in the Hebrew scriptures. Selecting individuals for suffering, using them as cautionary examples, and discarding them once their usefulness is complete. Jesus' treatment of Judas mirrors Yahweh's treatment of humanity, demanding loyalty, exploiting devotion, and then condemning the very ones he claims to love. This makes Jesus appear as a continuation of Yahweh's pathology. Their relationship, therefore, is less about a benevolent father and obedient son, and more about 2 narcissists enabling one another's abuse. Jesus' obedience unto death reflects this dynamic. His willingness to serve as Yahweh's flying monkey, rationalizing and promoting Yahweh's cruelty as though it were righteous. And yet, even this twisted alliance fractures. On the cross, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27:46. In that moment, Yahweh abandons him, exactly as narcissists inevitably devour their own when they can no longer serve their purpose. Jesus himself is condemned by Yahweh. The cycle of betrayal continues upward, revealing the ultimate truth of narcissistic systems. No one is safe, not even the enablers themselves. Even the Son of God is not spared from the cannibalism of narcissistic power. When Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" he revealed the extent of his narcissism. That line from Psalm 22 was the calculated performance of someone who could not let go of the image he had built for himself. To the very end, Jesus refused to die authentically. He could not bear the thought of appearing as just another failed revolutionary or ordinary man crushed by Rome. Instead, he reached out for a script that framed his humiliation as divine fulfillment. This reveals something chilling about his pathology. The narcissism was not just superficial, but absolute. Most people in their final moments strip away performance and face reality. Jesus, however, doubled down. His ego was so enmeshed with the Messiah narrative that even while being tortured to death, he was still spinning the story and trying to control perception. To die in that way while clinging so desperately to a role rather than his own humanity shows how enslaved he was to the identity he constructed. His mother Mary sure started the foundation, but we understand that after a certain age, narcissists tend to find new ways to feed into their own delusions. He could not admit weakness. He could not say plainly that he had been betrayed and abandoned, even by Yahweh. Instead, he disguised his collapse with prophecy so that even his failure appeared holy. That is the ultimate mark of narcissism, the inability to exist outside of the performance, even in death. The cruel paradox is that while he appeared to give everything for humanity, he demanded everything in return. Total loyalty, unquestioned obedience, and the sacrifice of individuality. And then, at the climax of the story, he abandons his disciples and humanity itself in physical form, leaving only the abstract promise of his presence in spirit. A promise that has left billions clinging to an invisible figure for centuries. Here lies the depth of betrayal. Judas handed Jesus over to death once, but Jesus trained generations of people to hand themselves over every day and abandon their own autonomy by staying bound to oppressive systems, calling their suffering holy. The net result is devastating because countless people wasted their only lives in devotion to a man who taught them that erasing themselves was the path to God. That is betrayal in the highest form. Jesus was not only consumed by Yahweh, but also by his narcissistic followers, as they ultimately want him on that cross eternally like a trophy. Narcissists truly do eat one another in the end. Truly, Jesus' teachings and actions reveal that his ultimate loyalty remains with Yahweh and the Jewish ideological framework in which he was raised. Despite claims of universal compassion, his ethics consistently circled back to prioritizing his chosen people. This is most apparent in moments where suffering could have demanded empathy, such as the infamous account of the starving child. A desperate Gentile woman pleads for her child's healing. Yet Jesus initially dismisses her with a declaration, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." When she persists, his response escalates to overt dehumanization. He said, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." Only after she accepts this degrading metaphor by lowering herself to the level of a begging animal does he finally grant her request. Jesus appears to withhold compassion because he requires a performance of submission that reinforces his authority and the exclusivity of his in-group. His empathy functions as a reward for compliance. This is characteristic of a narcissistic pattern where care is selectively dispensed to those who validate the leader's identity and superiority. Moreover, the story exposes the dissonance between Jesus' supposed universal mission of love and his concrete behavior. He could have immediately acted with compassion towards a starving child, but instead used the situation to reinforce ethnic and theological boundaries. His loyalty to Yahweh's exclusivist covenant overrides the suffering of an innocent. and his willingness to center the exchange around her humiliation shows how empathy is manipulated for self-confirmation rather than extended freely. Seen in this light, Jesus' behavior cannot be excused as mere testing of faith. It is consistent with a deeper pathology of altruistic narcissism, in which self-sacrifice, poverty, and selective miracles are performed to consolidate moral superiority while minimizing the legitimacy of others' pain. This selective compassion demonstrates both bias and imperfection. Jesus chose when and to whom empathy was extended, showing favoritism to those within his tribe or to moments that reinforced that he was the Messiah. Jesus showed that he was not above the narrowness of his inherited religious ideology, but remained bound to it. The Canaanite woman's encounter with Jesus also reveals the precarious balance he maintained between authority and the self-worth of others. Unlike Judas, who bore the brunt of Jesus' scapegoating, the woman becomes a different kind of threat. She knows her child's suffering is unjust, and she asserts her right to seek help even though she is outside the chosen group. In doing so, she presents a subtle challenge to Jesus' control, because she demonstrates self-esteem with the capacity to ask without collapsing into despair. For someone operating within a covertly narcissistic framework, this is intolerable. Narcissistic personalities often want others desperate enough to depend on them, but not confident enough to question or negotiate. By calling her and her people dogs, Jesus attempted to humiliate her into submission, to reestablish the power imbalance where compassion flows only on his terms. Her persistence, refusing to accept degradation, yet cleverly reworking his insults, which was even the dogs eat the crumbs, backed him into a corner where he could no longer withhold without appearing cruel in front of his audience. Her persistence was admirable, but the fact that she had to grovel for crumbs while affirming her own inferiority shows how compassion under Jesus' authority was transactional. Insidiously, Christianity later canonized this interaction as exemplary faith. Believers are told to identify with the woman and accept scraps of worth from God. As a result, they see themselves as undeserving sinners who must be grateful for crumbs. Perhaps they even see abuse as love. Degradation somehow becomes humility, and exclusion as divine order. While the Canaanite woman reframed Jesus' insults into a faith statement when she said, "Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table," effectively gaslighting herself into compliance with his narrative, Judas did the opposite. He saw through the facade and refused to degrade himself endlessly to maintain Jesus' superiority. This is where the stories intersect as mirrors. One internalized the scapegoat role to survive, while the other retaliated against it for years, bearing its weight. Jesus' dynamic with both figures reveals the mechanics of his narcissistic control. With Judas, he cast him into the role of the ultimate betrayer. In both cases, the people around him were props in his performance of altruistic suffering. I would argue that despite Jesus' ruthless persistence in breaking Judas down, Judas still loved him the most. He resisted for as long as he could, but eventually succumbed to the relentless pressure, culminating in his suicide. In John 15:13, Jesus declared, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." Yet it was Judas, not Peter or John, who most fully embodied this dictum. By accepting the role of the scapegoat, Judas surrendered not only his life, but his eternal reputation, condemned as the betrayer for all time. One cannot dismiss the unsettling possibility that Jesus' words themselves were a calculated provocation coercing Judas into proving his love through self-destruction. Judas's death, then, was the coerced fulfillment of Jesus' own standard of greater love. In this light, Judas becomes the one who bore eternal shame so that prophecy could be realized. Jesus' glory, therefore, was not secured in spite of Judas, but through him. Through a sacrifice so complete and devastating that no other disciple was willing to make it.